Welcome back, everyone. The world woke to a new kind of tension, a moment that many feared but few thought would arrive in such abrupt clarity. It began with a strike that echoed across global capitals, jarring diplomats, militaries, and civilians alike. Iran launched a sudden and unprecedented attack on an American military base in the Middle East. The shockwaves rippled outward instantly, setting the stage for one of the most dangerous geopolitical periods in recent memory. The attack was not merely a flashpoint. It became a defining moment that thrust the world onto high alert. When the missiles and rockets were first detected over Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, near the capital Doha, sirens blared and defense systems hummed to life. Iran had fired a barrage of missiles toward a major U.S. military installation, one of the largest in the region, housing American forces and strategic operations. Despite no reported casualties, because U.S. and Qatari Patriot interceptors successfully stopped most threats and authorities had been given warning, the symbolism of the strike was profound. For the first time in years, American forces had been directly targeted by Iran in a deliberate attack. Anadolu Agency +1 in Washington. The reaction was immediate. National security officials convened, emergency alerts were reviewed, and the Department of Homeland Security issued warnings about a heightened threat environment. Not only in the Middle East but globally. Officials cautioned that groups aligned with Tehran or inspired by the attack could attempt cyberattacks, low-level operations, or other forms of retaliation against American interests abroad. Intelligence analysts made clear that Iran maintains a deep network of actors capable of both conventional and unconventional responses, and that the world had entered a period of unpredictable volatility. Anadolu Agency across Tehran. State leadership framed the operation as a justified act of defense. Iran's top diplomat and foreign minister declared that if the United States or its allies were to strike Iranian interests again, Tehran would fire back with everything we have. The rhetoric was stark and concise. Confrontation was no longer a threat in the abstract, it was an immediate possibility. Iran insisted its actions were in response to prior American military strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities, and blamed Washington for stoking internal unrest within the country. New York Post. The context to this moment stretches back months and even years. Tensions between Tehran and Washington had steadily escalated over a range of conflicts, from proxy engagements in Iraq and Syria to disputes over nuclear development and sanctions. Earlier military actions, including U.S. airstrikes on Iranian nuclear sites, had already drawn global reactions and raised fears of escalation. Many world leaders had expressed concern that direct involvement by the United States in Middle Eastern conflicts could inflame regional tensions and risk a broader confrontation. Wikipedia. But for millions around the world, the sudden nature of Iran's attack was a jolt. News cycles filled with footage of intercepted missiles, statements by generals and ministers, and analysts trying to unpack what this meant for global security. In capitals from Riyadh to Berlin, Tokyo to Brasilia, governments issued statements urging restraint and caution, even as they braced for possible fallout. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Qatar, and other Arab states had already been deeply concerned about rising volatility. Diplomatic efforts between Washington and regional powers, only days earlier, had focused on discouraging military confrontation and encouraging dialogue. 4 Arab states, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Oman, and Egypt, had urged against escalation that could destabilize the Middle East, fearing that conflict would not remain contained and could threaten oil markets, economic growth, and regional stability. Reuters. In the United States, political leaders spoke to the nation and the world. They emphasized that while American forces had not suffered direct casualties in the attack, the aggression marked a dangerous escalation that must not go unanswered. Some lawmakers called for a measured response, arguing that diplomatic channels should be exhausted first. Others urged decisive action, asserting that attacks on American troops or installations represent unacceptable challenges to national security. The debates reverberated within the halls of Congress and the Pentagon alike. For ordinary Americans and global citizens watching from afar, the palpable fear was not just of missiles and military hardware, but of what could unfold next. Would this trigger a broader war? Would alliances be tested? Could this lead to a conflict that draws in NATO members, Gulf Cooperation Council states, and powers such as Russia and China? As defense analysts pointed out, Iran's strategy was shaped by years of standing confrontations, and Tehran likely chose its targets and timing carefully, aiming to send a message without provoking a full-scale war it could not win outright. International institutions immediately weighed in, urging calm. The United Nations Secretary General condemned violence from all sides and warned that the spiral of retaliation could quickly spin beyond anyone's control. The global body called for an urgent meeting of Security Council members to seek a diplomatic way out, emphasizing that any further military actions would carry grave consequences for civilian populations and international peace. Through these discussions, it became clear that the current crisis was not a localized dispute, but a potential test of the entire global order. Amid the political maneuvering, ordinary people grappled with uncertainty. Markets reacted nervously, with oil prices fluctuating on fears of disruption in the Gulf. Share indices wavered as investors reassessed risk in a world now openly discussing the possibility of major conflict in the Middle East. Communities with ties to military families in the U.S. watched anxiously for news of troop movements and safety measures. In Tehran and cities across Iran, large screens broadcast government messages, framing the strike as a historic moment of defiance and national pride. In Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, air raid sirens and defense drills reminded citizens that even regional neighbors were not immune to the repercussions of heightened hostilities. Analysts and historians reminded audiences that the Middle East had long been a crucible of global tensions, a place where local disputes entangle with global powers' strategic ambitions. But rarely had the world witnessed direct military exchanges between a major Middle Eastern nation and the United States since the conflicts of the early 21st century. Experts suggested that Tehran's decision to strike a U.S. military base, even with careful warnings to prevent casualties, was indicative of a new tactic, demonstrating capability and resolve while seeking to limit the conflict's expansion. Still, they cautioned that any miscalculation could quickly push events beyond diplomatic containment. International alliances, too, were tested. NATO members convened emergency sessions to assess collective defense strategies and reassure Eastern European allies concerned about global instability. Russia and China, traditional opponents of U.S. dominance in global affairs, weighed in with their own calculated responses. Some condemned Western aggression and backed Iran's call for respect of sovereignty, while others quietly monitored for shifts that might allow greater influence in Middle Eastern geopolitics. The geopolitical chessboard was shifting with every statement, every troop movement, every intercepted missile. Within the United States, military planners prepared contingencies ranging from reinforced defense postures in the Gulf to strategic communications aimed at de-escalating tensions while preserving deterrence. Cybersecurity teams issued advisories to corporations and government agencies about potential threats from pro-Iranian hacktivists or state-affiliated cyber units. Homeland Security warned of possible mobilization of extremist cells stirred by the conflict's narrative. Daily life intersected with national security in ways that had not been seen since Cold War-era alerts. Anadolu Agency compounding the tension was domestic unrest within Iran itself. The government faced persistent and violent protests sparked by economic hardship and political grievances. Independent human rights organizations reported thousands of deaths in the crackdown, making these protests some of the deadliest internal unrest episodes in decades. Iranian leaders, however, often blamed external forces, including the United States, for instigating discontent and sought to unify the population against perceived foreign interference. AP News, as days turned into weeks after the strike, global citizens remained on edge. Diplomats pursued back-channel negotiations. Intelligence officials shared analyses across borders. Journalists reported from front lines and capitals alike, trying to piece together the motivations and likely outcomes of this new chapter in international relations. Public opinion was deeply fractured. Some people around the world saw Iran's attack as a justified act of sovereignty and resistance against overwhelming military pressure. Others viewed it as reckless aggression that risked plunging millions into chaos. For many, the prevailing sentiment was a desperate hope that cooler heads would prevail. Yet beneath the surface of official statements, deep strategic calculations continued. Iran's leadership asserted that its actions were measured symbolic rather than destructive, a way to assert regional deterrence without provoking all-out war. U.S. commanders assessed whether to reinforce bases, reposition naval assets, or engage in targeted diplomatic outreach to reassure allies. Gulf states, nervous about being drawn into broader conflict, worked tirelessly to keep channels open with both Tehran and Washington, emphasizing mutual economic interests and regional stability. Meanwhile, global civil society, from peace activists to UN humanitarian agencies, voiced urgent calls for de-escalation and dialogue. They warned that military escalation anywhere in the Middle East threatened global humanitarian, economic, and security conditions, from refugee flows to energy markets to international law norms. They urged world leaders to recognize that direct military confrontation between great powers endangers non-combatants far beyond the initial theaters of conflict. In homes, schools, and workplaces, discussions shifted from daily routines to nightly news briefs. People debated what this new geopolitical reality meant for travel safety, global economics, national security, and the future of international institutions. Academics and commentators pointed to historical parallels and cautionary tales, reminding audiences that periods of heightened alert often hinge on fragile communication channels that, if broken, can trigger irreversible cycles of violence. And yet, even in that atmosphere of tension and anxiety, diplomats continued to speak of negotiation, peace accords, and conflict prevention. Quiet meetings between ambassadors became venues for reducing mistrust. Neutral countries offered to host talks. International mediators proposed frameworks to address the underlying disputes, from nuclear program oversight to sanctions relief to broader regional security pacts. In the end, the sudden attack by Iran on an American base did more than shock the world. It forced a reckoning with the fragility of peace in a world where military might, national pride, and historical grievances intersect. It laid bare the enormous risks of confrontation in a nuclear age, where missteps can escalate with terrifying speed. It reminded every government and citizen that global stability cannot be taken for granted, that it requires constant effort, thoughtful diplomacy, and a shared commitment to conflict resolution that values human life above strategic dominance. As the world continued to stay on alert, one question loomed larger than all others. Would this moment become the start of a long and destructive cycle of retaliation, or the catalyst for a renewed push toward negotiation, restraint, and lasting peace? Only time would tell, but the urgency of that answer was now a daily reality for billions around the globe.